A few weeks back on the news segment, I briefly talked about how autonomous vehicles are going to get the green light on motorways, supposedly within the next 12 months. Now, this was a story that shocked quite a few motorists, including myself, because, despite the millions of pounds spent in developing autonomous technology, the idea of a driverless car is still, well, it still feels quite out there, doesn't it? In short, there's a lot of confusion about autonomous vehicles that will soon be legalised here on British roads. So in this segment, I thought that it would be quite a useful idea to take a look at the story behind driverless vehicles, the ways in which autonomy works, and as well as that, some of the pros and cons that they can give us. And we may as well start at the very beginning. Now, you might think that the first driverless cars came about only a few years ago. After all, they've really only been widely discussed by the general public for around a decade now. However, in reality, the idea of a car that drove itself was first thought about almost a century ago. In 1925, an electrical engineer called Francis Houdina, and that is of course not to be confused with Houdini, demonstrated to the world a car that could drive itself. Well, kind of. In all seriousness, the most advanced part of his design was an antenna that could pick up signals by somebody controlling it nearby. However, it certainly impressed people when it seemingly went for a bit of a trip on its own, travelling for about 12 miles between Broadway and Fifth Avenue in New York, and only crashing into one other vehicle. I mean, alright, that was technically a driverless car, but if you want to actually talk about true autonomy in a vehicle, we actually have to go forward to the 1980s and talk about a guy called Ernst Dickmanns. A university professor, Ernst spent the best part of this decade playing around with his Mercedes van. He started out by fitting all manner of cameras and sensors to the outside. Then he connected the steering, the accelerator, brakes and the clutch to a computer which allowed him to actually control parts of the van simply by typing in commands. But why bother manually typing out whatever you wanted your vehicle to do when you could simply let the computer do it for you? And so in 1986 he wrote a bit of software that, in effect, allowed the van to move on its own using the information picked up via the sensors to prevent any collisions. During the following year, using a closed-off section of the Autobahn, Ernst Dickmanns' van managed to successfully drive on its own at speeds of up to 96 km an hour, that's just shy of 60, and thus the first truly driverless vehicle was born. Now, to say that a lot has been developed in the world of driverless cars since then is the understatement of the century. Just about everything has improved since 1987, and we've still got a long, long way to go before they can be seen as perfect. But before we get ahead of ourselves, why don't we take a look at the types of autonomous vehicle that are currently with us, and the kind of things that they're capable of doing on their own. As it stands, there are 5 different levels of autonomy, with another one expected to be with us by 2030. As you would imagine, level 0 is nada. The driver has to do everything themselves, or the vehicle will simply just, not move at all or roll into whatever obstacle lies in front of it. Level 1, on the other hand, is where we start to see both the driver and the car working together. I mean, don't get me wrong, these are still vehicles that you have to drive yourself, but they do include systems to assist, for instance self-parking or automatic emergency braking. By the time we get into level 2, the driver can start to take their feet away from the pedals and their hands away from the steering wheel. Now, these vehicles contain features such as adaptive cruise control, i.e. it matches the speed of the vehicle in front, and lane correction, meaning that it can use the lane markings on the road to steer itself, at least to some degree. Now, of course, that does sound very good, but it's not exactly perfect, meaning that the driver still has to stay alert at all times, just in case they need to regain controls. Not exactly the perfect driverless experience. And sadly, the same can be said about vehicles that fall into level 3. Now, these vehicles have more intelligent sensors around them that help to make intelligent driving decisions. Say, for instance, someone steps out into the road, the car would be able to effectively steer itself around. Stuff like that. And that brings us on to level 4, currently the only level of autonomy that actually allows us to have a truly driverless vehicle. Now, here the vehicles use artificial intelligence algorithms that effectively will see something and follow a routine which tells it how to react. Now, a lot of the time this will be based on previous experiences that were coded into it, but for reasons that we'll get onto in a few moments, they're not always perfect. But before we move on to that, it is worth us quickly talking about the upcoming 5th level of autonomy, which really is quite clever. At this level, not only will vehicles be able to fully control themselves, but they'll also be able to communicate with other vehicles around them using 5G. Now, this is a process that's known as vehicle-to-vehicle communication, or V2V for short. To give you an example of just how this could be useful, say that you're travelling along a busy high street in your shiny new driverless car. You can't see it yet, but another car a few vehicles behind you has had to pull over to make space for an ambulance. Now that car would be able to send a message to yours, effectively telling it to pull over as there's an ambulance approaching. Or, to give you another example, perhaps there's a queue at a set of traffic lights. When it turns green, instead of one car moving away followed by the vehicle behind it and then the next one and so on, all vehicles could effectively move away at pretty much the same time, meaning that there's much more of a chance of you getting through before the lights turn red again. It's all certainly something to look forward to, but that's not to say autonomous vehicles don't have their issues, or for that matter their misconceptions. For starters, there is the practicality in today's world. Now, as we all know from the past few months, the price of pretty much everything on wheels has gone up, meaning that something with the latest LiDAR sensors and cameras and 5G connectivity will come with, sadly, a sky-high price tag. Now, of course, some might argue that a driverless vehicle should be ownerless, the idea being that you would order one a bit like you would with an Uber, but that means that there'd have to be some kind of middleman involved to buy or rent out the vehicles, so it would still be no cheaper than, say, ordering a taxi to get everywhere. And that brings us on to our next problem. What happens to all of the people who drive for a living, be it a taxi cab or a heavy goods vehicle? As it stands, it's currently too early to say whether the days of being paid to drive people or goods is over, but in a world of autonomy, there wouldn't really be a need for them. Now, of course, there are also some moral issues as well. If you don't have to drive an autonomous vehicle, you technically don't really need a driving license. And if you don't need a driving license, you don't have to be over the age of 17. Potentially, in the eyes of the law, it would be perfectly fine to hop into one and tell it where to go when you're well and truly drunk. And finally, and admittedly much less of an issue than the ones that we've talked about so far, there's also the matter of people like me who actually like to drive. In a world where everyone's vehicles drives themselves, it may well be discouraged or perhaps even illegal to actually drive a car yourself, at least on the public roads where you could, in theory, terrorise surrounding vehicles if you wanted to. However, I don't want you to go away from this segment thinking that autonomous vehicles are the root of all evil, because they're really not. So to wrap things up, why don't we talk about some of the advantages that they have? First up, there is the most obvious advantage, and that is machines never get tired or bored or drunk. They are not always perfect, but generally speaking, they're as good driving around at 2 AM as they are at 2 PM. What's more, they're programmed to follow the law and will only really break any kind of traffic rules in really extreme cases. Now, of course, the upshot of that is you'll never see an autonomous vehicle running a red light or speeding, which in turn means that there will be less of a need to actually police traffic. In both cases, this leads to vehicles that are less likely to crash, not only meaning that the fatality rates of our roads should decrease quite significantly, but fewer roads would need to be closed in order to divert any further danger, and that means that there would be fewer queues on the road as well. Evidently then, there are both good and bad things to say about autonomous vehicles, and as it stands, barely any vehicles that can be classed as autonomous are truly driverless. However, given the amount of money that's being spent in order to develop and perfect these systems, along with, of course, the aforementioned law in Britain, which is starting to really welcome them, it is plain to see that the driverless car will, in some capacity at least, be a feature of the road sooner rather than later.